I mean, so Wesley's whole thing is like love. And if you're going to go with, thinking queer about any like queer life or LGBTQ issues, you have like the whole like love is love thing is a little bit trite and a little bit like whatever at this point. But if you want to use it, like Wesley is your dude. Like he would
Yeah.
be all about that kind of. Again, there's not like in any way am I saying like John Wesley himself would be like an affirming person today. Like honestly, maybe not, probably not. But there's so much in his work that is really generative for thinking about sexual liberation and gender liberation, really.
Hello and welcome to Out Loud, a podcast by and for queer people of faith in the South. Here we tell our stories of varied religious upbringings, messy coming outs, and the gift of community with one another. I'm your host, Greg Thompson, and the voice you just heard was Keegan Osinski. Keegan is the Librarian for Theological Studies and Ethics at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. She holds a Master of Library and Information Science from the University of Washington and studied Philosophy and Theology at Point Loma Nazarene University. Her work is naturally informed by her faith. Keegan belongs to the Church of the Nazarene, which is a tradition informed by John Wesley, a well-known theologian from the 1700s. In Keegan's book, Queering Wesley, Queering the Church, she examines Wesley's sermons through a queer lens. Together, we talk about her choice to stay in the Church of the Nazarene and her positive experiences within her churches, despite the denomination's unaffirming stance on queer inclusion. And while Keegan feels comfortable towing the line in her own denomination, we talk about the boundaries all of us might need to keep in mind when we disagree with the church's beliefs. Keegan identifies as queer or bisexual and uses she, her, hers pronouns. Before we dive in, just a few announcements. If you're in the Richmond, Virginia area, you can catch me this month teaching yoga at the Boho Fit Studio. I'm doing a restorative class on Mondays at 5:30 p.m. and a Vinyasa flow class on Wednesdays at 5:30 p.m. We'll have fun getting stretchy, and most importantly, we'll relax. Whether you've practiced yoga before or not, I would love to see you there. A link to the schedule is in the show notes. Next, I mentioned on our last show that I'm now offering spiritual direction online. This is a great way to carry on the kind of conversations that I have with guests of the show. Perhaps you're stuck in your own faith journey or just wondering how your sexuality can fit in with your spirituality. Spiritual direction is a process where we'll walk through those questions together. You can sign up for a session on my website, and that link is in the show notes too. And finally, Out Loud does not happen without your help. As we head into this holiday season, consider making a one-time gift to the show or becoming a member of our Patreon page to give regularly. Any contribution is greatly appreciated. Again, just follow the link in the show notes. And now, let's hear from Keegan Osinski. Well, thanks for coming on the show today. I'm excited to chat.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So a question I always like to ask folks just to kind of get started is, can you tell me about the religious or spiritual background of your childhood?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of funny because I am, in religion and academic religious spaces. I go to church. I'm like always thinking about Christianity and theology. It's just like such an integral part of my life. But my family is not really religious at all. I didn't grow up going to church. It's actually really funny. Like, I didn't even know people went to church on Christmas until I was like 14. Like, I didn't realize like Christmas was like a religious holiday. Or Easter, we would go to church on Easter. So I knew, like, obviously Jesus rose from the dead, but I didn't really know anything about the dying part. Like, so it's actually just kind of a funny situation. Eventually, I started going to youth group with like friends from school. So, a lot of times at youth group, they're like, bring your friends. And like, I was the friend that got brought around. And so that's kind of how I ended up going to church in the first place around like middle school, high school. But yeah, so my family is not particularly religious at all. I know far too many people who have really contentious relationships with their family,
Mm,
especially, queer folks who've had to deal with more conservative religious upbringings and stuff like that. So I got really lucky, I guess, in the sense that, on the one hand, I missed out on stuff like Bible quizzing and Sunday school and all those kind of like weird cultural quirks, but also I missed out on all of the like religious trauma of
true.
having a religious family.
Totally. I talked to someone else before who came from a similar upbringing. And so my question is, was it a bigger deal to your family, you coming out or you going to church?
Right. I mean, kind of neither. Like my family has
Okay.
been like I was raised to be very independent, and so my
Okay.
family has always been like, do your thing. We support you. Like you can do whatever you want to do. It is pretty funny, especially once I started studying theology in college and like getting involved in church. I would come home like for holidays and it'd be like Thanksgiving and we'd be like getting ready to eat. My family would like be like, do you want to pray? Like, it was just like this kind of like weird, awkward moment. I'm like, no, 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 we don't have to pray. It's
That's
fine.
funny. So what church did you get involved in with like this youth group?
So initially it was a very conservative, evangelical, non-denominational kind of church. And it's really, I mean, I, I've told this story so many times and it's still just funny to me because it was this really conservative place, and then when I went to college, I went to, Point Loma Nazarene University, and now I'm involved with the Church of the Nazarene, which
Mm,
is also a really conservative evangelical denomination, but I didn't really know that at the time. I just, like,
yeah.
was going to a Christian school for college, and when I started studying theology there, I would come home to my home church that was this like even more conservative, like fundamentalist almost kind of situation.
Wow.
And they were like, women can't preach, women shouldn't be, working outside the home, women need to be submissive and, get married, stay home, have a million babies, and homeschool them. And I mean, that was never me. I mean, I tried
Yeah.
and I prayed that I would be that kind of person, but I never was. That's one thing my family, I think, probably they've never said it to my face, but I'm sure when I was involved with that, they were kind of like,
Hmm.
that's not great. But once I started studying theology and getting more involved with the Church of the Nazarene, my home church was just kind of like, no, like you are learning about feminism, you're learning about like Arminian theology, which is different from the Calvinism that they were into. And they were just like, this is not okay. So that whole relationship and community just kind of like fell apart under my feet. And I ended
Mm,
up being kind of welcomed into the Church of the Nazarene because that was the folks, my professors and other, colleagues at school where there were a lot of Nazarenes and they were like, we've always ordained women, we like believe in like, you know, taking care of the poor and things like this. And so I was like, great, this is like a more progressive kind of environment. But the more I got involved with that, the more I found. And then once I moved from California to the South and
mhm,
got more involved with the Church of the Nazarene as a denomination instead of in a university in Southern California,
mhm,
I
yeah.
found out like, oh, actually this denomination is also quite conservative. They have some really good doctrines on the books that I think have a lot of space for really open progressive thinking,
Mm,
but in reality, the vast majority of the clergy and the laity are still quite conservative in even in their theology sometimes and certainly in like their views on social issues. However, like I said, I think there's a lot of space in the denomination and their doctrine as
yeah.
like a Wesleyan denomination for like a lot. I just think there's so much wiggle room there, and that is kind of like how my project got started,
Yeah.
right? Because I'm in this situation in this environment and I'm seeing all like the really interesting connections and cool like ways that we could kind of have some like freedom and do some interesting things. And because I wasn't raised in this denomination, I can kind of see it with fresh eyes a little bit, but it's still, at the end of the day, it's still a very conservative denomination.
That is so fascinating and really relatable for me, coming from a Roman Catholic background myself, being raised in that setting where it's largely or kind of known to be more conservative, and especially when it comes to LGBT rights, like there's just a hard line there. But my experience has been similar. Like I've had communities or I've seen pockets and room for more debate and people who are willing to engage in that. That's really encouraging. And some of us can see that and can do something about it. And some of us see that and are like, I don't even want to get involved. And I think it's great that like you're wanting to get into that
Yeah,
conversation.
exactly. And I also, have a certain level of privilege there because,
Mm,
I know so many people who grew up in the Church of the Nazarene who are queer and have had to leave it because it's not an affirming denomination. Maybe they have a call to ministry and they're not going to be able to get ordained, or they have, parents who are, like, well, the church is not affirming, so I don't, believe in your lifestyle or whatever. And I don't have like that piece of it. Like the Church of the Nazarene is not like hasn't like there's nothing like that for me because I am not ordained, I'm not seeking ordination, and I don't have this like background where the church has been, hurtful to me. I've really only had a lot of positive experiences with it and with the people in the church. And so I have this place of privilege where I can stay. And there's, I talk to people all the time who are like, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I should, people who are allies or people who are queer themselves who are like, I don't know if I should stay in this church. It's so difficult. And I'm always like, you can go, like, be at
mhm.
peace. Like, if it's harmful for you, if it's not healthy for you to be in these spaces, like, go. But for whatever reason, it's not been unhealthy for me. It doesn't bother me. No, there's definitely people who like don't like me, but it's like, what are they going to do? Like you're like make a phone call, send an email, like whatever. I still go to my church every week and, worship with my community and hang out with my friends, so it's
Yeah.
like that it doesn't impact me in the same way. So I kind
Well,
of get to do that.
and that's kind of the beauty, I think, of like the track that you're on, having talked to Kashif on the show before, who works in your same office, like
Yeah.
where you're taking this like academic and like librarian track that sort of gives you room to do all the deep work and ask deep questions and help people ask deep questions, but you're not beholden to this church that you're a part of, and they can't really make a decision or really like silence you, to my knowledge.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so that's a
I'm
really cool position to be in.
Yeah, and I think I talk about this in my book in the introduction, why this kind of book hasn't been written yet. Like why has it taken so long? Especially because as I was writing it, I'm like, this is not that hard. Like someone should have done this already. But it's because the people who would do it are, say theologically educated ministers, professors at seminaries, these people who are very deeply intertwined professionally and with their livelihood in these unaffirming denominations. And so it really is a risk for them to teach or write or do this kind of work. If they're ordained, they're risking their credentials. If they are a professor, they're risking, their teaching post, these kinds of things. But for me, I mean, I'm not ordained. I'm a lay person. I am theologically educated. I have, a couple of theology degrees, but I don't work at a denominational school. The Church of the Nazarene doesn't pay my bills.
Yeah.
And like, there's not a lot that can be done. And the way the polity of the Church of the Nazarene works is that as far as like discipline or membership, you are a member of your local congregation.
Mm.
And so the local congregation does any kind of discipline and things like that.
Mm.
And so I'm, lucky to be in a space where my congregation cares for me, supports me, loves me, whether or not they like agree with everything I've written or do or whatever, like that's kind of immaterial because we are in a community together. And so I don't really have to worry about losing my job or anything like that.
I was wondering, like, how was it finding that church when you came to Nashville?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've been so lucky because I was part of a Nazarene church in San Diego before I moved out here. That was, one of the more progressive ones. A lot of the people who had gone to Point Loma, my college, and we had a lot in common and a lot of trying to think about how the church could be a more open and welcoming space, a more um, social justice minded space. And when I moved to Nashville, there's also a Nazarene school here at Trevecca.
Mm.
And so I kind of figured that there would be other people that I could find and connect with. The Church of Nazarene is a very small world. So it's like, if you know one Nazarene, you know a bunch. So I was like, I'm sure I'll be able to find somebody. And there are a couple of progressive congregations in town. And so the one that I go to, I was able to find, and there's a couple of, professors that teach at Trevecca that go there, and a couple of people from Vanderbilt from the divinity school that go there or have gone there. And so it was just, there's several Nazarene churches in town, but, it's pretty easy to kind of narrow down which ones would be a better fit.
That's great. Well, that's great. I mean, it's great that you had that clarity kind of going in, because it can be so tricky finding a church when you are worried about like whether or not you'll be accepted there.
Oh
So,
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
so how did you decide, kind of going back a little bit, like how did you decide on library and information science as like a track for you before you moved into like the theology side, or were those kind of intertwined?
They definitely went together. So in undergrad, I studied philosophy and theology. That was my degree.
Okay.
And I worked as a student worker in the library. And I loved working in the library. It was a great job to have as a student. And I loved studying theology. And I wanted to keep doing that. But I knew early on, like, I didn't really want to be a professor. It just like kind of scares me. I do like teaching now that I have been, doing some teaching as a librarian. I'm like, I do like it. But even still, I don't want to like teach a whole like a full load of classes.
Mm.
And I don't necessarily want to be like, in librarianship, we talk about the sage on the stage versus the guide on the side. So
I like
like
that.
this idea of like having a person up front giving a lecture versus, a buddy like coming alongside you and like let's do this together kind of thing. And I'm much more interested in the latter, which I feel like I can do as a librarian.
Mm.
So I knew pretty early on, like I didn't want to do like the traditional, like get a PhD, try to get a job. And now that I see what the job market is like for academics, it's like a nightmare. I'm extra glad I didn't go that route.
You chose wisely.
So when I was in undergrad, I was like, okay, I know I don't really want to do that, but I like working in the library. I like working in the academic world. So maybe I could be a librarian. And I just kind of started looking into that. And I found out like, okay, you have to get a master's degree to be a librarian. Like, okay, I can do that. And then I found out that theological librarianship was a thing. And I was
Amazing.
like, there, done, easy. That's it. That's me. That's what I want to do. So I just kind of was able to sketch out a plan where I was going to do library school. I was going to get a job at, some school, some seminary or something that had a library that had a theology program. And then I was going to get a master's in theology and I was going to be a theological librarian. And then I did that.
How I got to pause you there. Like how did you find that clarity?
A lot of it's luck. Like I talk about it a lot. Like, obviously, like I am a hard worker. I am like a goal oriented, like workaholic kind of person. But also, like I don't know how this all worked. Honestly, So when I applied for the job at Vanderbilt, so first I applied before I finished library school. So I did library school through the University of Washington online full time while I worked full time
Wow.
at Point Loma. So after I graduated, I was able to come back full time in the library as, it's like a paraprofessional is what it's called, as opposed to like the professional level
Mm.
of like a librarian. So I was working full time at Point Loma and doing my library degree. And so I just kind of started like looking at different places, different schools. And then I just found this job posting at Vanderbilt in Nashville for basically the same paraprofessional job I was doing in San Diego. So it was like a lateral move. But I was like, Vanderbilt Divinity School's here. It's a big school. It seems like really nice. I had never been to Nashville in my life before I rolled up in my U-Haul. But I applied for that job, and during the interview process, like it was super fun. It was really like, yes, everything was clicking. I'm like, yes, this is
Yeah.
exactly what I want to do. This is where I want to be, the kind of place I want to be. And they kept telling me, they were like, this is not the kind of job people move across the country for. I think it was like $14 an hour. Like it was just like basically the same job I was doing. But I was like, no, like this is part of my master plan. Like, trust
Just
me.
go with it. Yeah.
And they're like, okay, come on over. And they hired me. And, that was over 8 years ago now. So
Wow.
in that time, I finished my library degree. I started my master's of theological studies at the divinity school here. I was able to get like a promotion from the paraprofessional position to an actual librarian position. And then I finished my MTS and I'm just like living the dream, and I get to teach, I get to work with students. I have time for my own research and writing, and it's just I get to work with like world-class faculty and
Hmm.
like help them with their research and their work. It's the coolest job. Again, like I try not to brag too much about it because but it is the coolest academic job. Like it's the best. I absolutely love it.
Tell me about the book. Like, why was this important, you think? And you were kind of getting on to this a little bit earlier, but like why was this such an important subject to you to write about right now?
Yeah. So, like I said, I kind of just had an idea. It started with an essay that I wrote partially for the Wesleyan Theological Society, which is, an academic professional organization, and partly for a queer theology class I was taking in the divinity school. And I was just, I'm a Wesleyan educated Nazarene person. So like John Wesley is just kind of like around in my brain. And I was like, what if I took one of John Wesley's sermons and I like subjected it to a queer reading? Like, what would happen? It really was just kind of an experiment. So the first one I did was his sermon, The Circumcision of the Heart. And this was in spring of 2017. And I wrote like a small, like 8-page paper for the conference and presented it. And so I don't know how many academic conferences you've been to, but it's basically just like people just like read their papers in front of like a classroom of like, 2 or 3 people, and like one of them's your mom. Like, it's like it's not,
They just read them
that.
verbatim, like word for word. Like, it's
Yeah.
not like a presentation. Okay. Okay.
Sometimes it is, but a lot of times people literally just get up there and read their paper. And so
Yeah.
it's just kind of like, you're not going to draw a crowd. However, I drew a crowd. Like it was wild. Like there was like standing room only, and like there were so many people that showed up. because, I
Wow.
mean, I guess it was because of the title. So it was Queering Wesley, Queering the Church. I think that was the title of the paper. And I think people were just like, what is this? And they were just like fascinated by the title. So they showed up to
Mm,
hear the paper. And in the moment, I had a few interesting questions and a little bit of discussion afterwards, but nothing too crazy. But in the like weeks afterwards, as people kind of had time to digest it, I guess, I was getting emails. There was just like a lot people were talking about it on Facebook, which like again, like this doesn't happen at academic conferences. Like you
yeah.
read your paper and like everyone's like, good job, nobody cares, moving on. There's this one conservative Methodist blogger who like wrote a blog post about it, and that got shared all over the place, and some people got really mad about it, and they were just like, I can't believe this. So obviously I touched a nerve,
Yeah.
and I was like, okay, there's something here. So I
Yeah.
took that eight-page paper, I turned it into a 20-page paper for my class. So I got to kind of dig in a little more and expand upon these ideas. And it was just such a really fun and interesting exercise in like theology. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to now do my master's thesis. So I have to do this like bigger project for my thesis. So I'm going to just keep working on this idea. So
Cool.
for that, I was like, okay, I'm going to do 2 more sermons. So I already did circumcision of the heart. I'm going to do, which ones did I do? I think I did the new birth and on perfection were the 2 sermons I did for my thesis. And then I wrote an introduction, like a big substantive introduction to the project. And that ended up being pretty much the introduction and 2 chapters of the book. And then circumcision of the heart ended up in the book too. And so, especially as I was writing the introduction, there's a lot in there that really kind of explains, like, first of all, no one's doing this. Second of all, why? And obviously, I gave some of those reasons already, but like, it's so rich. Like, the Wesleyan theology, Wesley's work itself, the Wesleyan tradition, there's so much here that is really generative and has a lot of space to do this kind of really like experimental work that opens up toward freedom and love and liberation. And that's something that like Wesleyans are all about. Like Methodists love this shit. And so Wesley's whole thing is like love. And if you're going to go with, thinking queer about any like queer life or LGBTQ issues, you have like the whole like love is love thing is a little bit trite and a little bit like whatever at this point. But if you want to use it, like Wesley is your dude. Like he would
Yeah.
be all about that kind of. Again, there's not like in any way am I saying like John Wesley himself would be like an affirming person today. Like honestly, maybe not, probably not. But there's so much in his work that is really generative for thinking about sexual liberation
Hmm.
and gender liberation, really. And it really, again, it wasn't that hard. I'm making some jumps to do it. It is a creative exercise. I'm not trying to like hide that, but it's not a far leap.
Uh,
And I hope that comes across. Like a lot of people who have read it at this point are like, oh my gosh, this work is so Wesleyan. It's so
hmm.
Wesleyan. And I tried really hard to really hold on to that because I really do believe that the Wesleyan tradition has a lot of potential to be an affirming, liberative kind of space.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was kind of a rant, but I
No, no, I love it. It's great. So for people who maybe aren't familiar with John Wesley, or even maybe this practice of kind of like analyzing and interpreting sermons, can you maybe like walk us through like an example of like what one of like what's something that was really rich for you in this process?
Sure. So John Wesley, so I'll start with this. So he was around in the 18th century. He was an Anglican priest, and he got in a lot of trouble with the Anglican church for going out and preaching outside to poor folks and working class folks. He was very invested in the poor, in bringing the gospel to all kinds of people and doing it outside. So
Mm.
a lot of stuff in the Wesleyan tradition. And so the Nazarenes are like combo Wesleyan Pentecostal a little bit. So
Okay.
you have this idea of like camp meeting and revivals. And a lot
Mm.
of this kind of goes back to John Wesley out in the field, like literal field preaching and, really just like bringing the gospel to the people and getting in trouble for it because the Anglican church was like, no, no, no. The gospel is in the church, in the building. We got to keep it here. And
Mhm.
he was not about that. And so a lot of these sermons, and I do a little bit, maybe I should have done more of like the kind of historical work or including more context for like where and when the sermons were
Mm.
preached. I do a little bit of it, but a lot of the sermons in the book were like preached outdoors originally. A lot of them were like then published in magazines and newspapers and stuff like that as well. But
Just really
the
helpful context, thinking about the audience and who it's for, potentially
yeah,
outside of the church. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And so, and the other thing to know about John Wesley is, he is the founder of Methodism. So his whole thing is this really methodical way of thinking about faith that has to do with self-reflection. He had like this list of questions that he would have, like he would create these small groups that would get together to like, you know, increase their faith and their discipleship. And a lot of these questions were like, where are you struggling? Where are you sinning? Where do you need grace? Where do you, and really like forcing people to sit down and take stock of their lives and their faith and the way that they're relating to God and their neighbor, and where they're putting their money. All of these kinds
Mhm.
of things are like these very like Wesleyan practices. So that's a little bit about Wesley. And then as far as queer theory and queering or queer reading, basically, this is a methodology where basically how I do it is I would take these sermons, I would read them over and over and over and over uh, until something like jumped out at me. And I had like a list of questions that I kind of would use too. So, really, how queer reading works is you are asking the text a bunch of questions, particularly having to do with upsetting any like gender or sexuality norms, questioning, assumptions, thinking about how sex and gender are functioning in the text, what they're doing and not doing, where the gaps are, like where
Mm.
the silence is. So you're asking a lot of these questions, who are the characters in this story? For example, if it's like from a Bible text, who are the characters? What are their genders? How do their genders affect their motivations or what they're
Yeah.
doing? I would ask, what would a queer person hear in this sermon that, maybe a straight person wouldn't? And there's a lot of that in there. It's like
Mm.
how do I personally, me, Keegan, as a queer person, hear these sermons? And, using my experience and my perspective to kind of like question what he's saying or bring it into today to
Mhm.
current ways of thinking that are perhaps more progressive sexually or whatever. Another thing that's really a fun practice when you're querying a text is gender swapping. So I love
Ooh.
to be like, okay, the characters in the story, what if they were different? Or what if this person in this story was queer? I have one little passage in the book where I talk about the story of Nicodemus coming to Jesus at night. And I'm like, Nicodemus, what are you doing there cruising for Jesus? What exactly is going
In
on
the
here?
evening, yeah.
So just kind of asking these questions and playing. So that's another
Yeah.
big thing about queer reading and queer theory is like this play and just kind of messing around with things and seeing what happens. So it is very, creative, it's experimental, it's fun. This is a big thing. Like, I've been studying theology for so freaking long. I am kind of bored of it in a lot of ways. Like the standard, like classical theology. I'm just like, okay, yeah, yeah, we get it. But this kind of opened things up a lot for me to just be
Mm.
able to play around and have fun with it. And I think a lot of people are kind of afraid to do that with the Bible or with, big, important figures like John Wesley, who,
Hmm.
are sacred in their own way a
Yeah.
little bit in these traditions. And I don't have that like same compunction or shame about it for
Yeah.
whatever reason. I'm just like, let's just mess around and see what happens. And it's really fun. And obviously, like some people get a little bit nervous about it, and that's okay. But I hope, in reading this, like it kind of opens people up to that playfulness of, a lot of that has like, Holy Spirit vibes, right? Of just like
Hmm.
which always, can be coded as queer because it's just like you don't really know what's going on there. It's so like flowy and like you can't nail it down. What is it, like nailing jello to a wall or whatever? Like it's not gonna stick. Like what you can't nail it down. And so I think there's a lot of that is really holy and, positive, life-giving way of thinking about theology.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I already am a big fan personally of like lectio divina, sacred reading, and kind of doing that in small group settings and whatnot. But then it's reminding me of going back to when I was studying theology and just the papers I wrote and kind of just how it can be fun to
Yeah.
really sit with a text like that. It's
Yeah, and
really cool.
especially like as I said, I would read these sermons like so many times just to kind of it was very like Lectio Divina kind of,
Mm,
just I just read these over and over and over until something clicked or I there was just some spark or something, Another question I get a lot is like how I chose the sermons that I
mm,
wrote about. And I like, it's funny, like I don't have a good answer because it's kind of the same thing. I just like went through, I mean, the version of John Wesley's collected works that I used has like, I think 150 of his sermons. And I didn't read all of them, but I just like, I did look at all of them. I
yeah.
flipped through, I read pieces and bits and titles and, I just kind of like immersed myself in all of the whole like opus until I just like found something that kind
Yeah.
of like gave me a little like, "Hey, what's up?" Like, and there's no like rhyme or reason to it really. But it's just, you read things until something happens and then you respond to it. It's just kind of a weird like magic.
Where does this project, now that this book is out in the world, where does this project kind of leave you? Where do you hope to kind of go from here?
Well, I don't know so much where it's going to take me, but I hope that other people will take
Mm,
it. There's definitely a sense that, like, especially when I was like doing final edits and stuff, I was like, oh, I could have done that. I could have done this. Like,
hmm.
this is absolutely like a starting point. It's a new thing. It's a new way of reading John Wesley and
Yeah.
using Wesley's work. And I have every belief in the Wesleyan tradition that pastors, teachers, preachers, professors can use this way of working with Wesley and make something really cool and really like lively and like useful and meaningful in a way that, maybe has kind of fallen to the wayside. You just think
Yeah.
like, oh, Wesley, he's like this stuffy old, 1700s white guy from England. Like, and, but he's still so important to the Wesleyan tradition, and there's so many denominations within the Wesleyan tradition. And I'm just like, we can still use Wesley. Like, he's so great. We just
Hmm.
have to like be a little creative with how we use him. And I just think like there's so many great, smart, creative people in the church that can do this same work. And I hope that this book is more just like permission
Mm,
and like an example, like a model. Like I'm just kind of modeling this method and that like I can like teach other people how to do it in ways that will work in their communities.
mm.
Um, So right now, I mean, I'm doing a lot of like interviews like this, so I'm getting to talk to a lot of people. I've been invited to, there's been some book clubs that popped up, which is really
Great.
fun. I'm actually tomorrow I have a meeting with I think it's like a Methodist clergy book club who read the book
Cool.
together. So I get
That's
to talk
great.
with them. There's a couple other like Methodist conferences that have invited me to talk a little bit about the work. And so I'm so just like tickled and pleased that like people are actually like reading it and it's actually like getting out there and doing something. It's so rare, especially like as academics, like we're just like doing this work and hoping that it does something. And it's so cool to like see people actually reading it and enjoying it. And so I hope that is kind of what's next, that it can go
Mhm.
into like the Wesleyan tradition and actually like change things. Like just the fact that that's a possibility, that could actually happen, that I could actually like make a difference in that way is like so cool.
Yeah. Is that a space that you want to keep being in, you think?
I
Or do
think
you have other
so.
ideas?
I mean, I don't have any reason not to. I love the Church of the Nazarene. I mean, I know it's like a huge like pain in the ass. Well, we're like I'm a pain in their ass, which like they know and they will tell me. But, like I just have such a soft spot and kind of like loyalty or obligation or something I feel to the denomination because of the way that Nazarenes have cared for me and, educated me and, given me a place to, do theology and worship over, the years. And so like, I know it's like not always a really comfy relationship, but it's good. And I'm happy to be a member of the denomination. And if I can be there for especially like younger folks in
Mm,
the denomination, especially like queer folks, if they can look and see like, oh, here's a queer Nazarene who's healthy and happy and doing okay, like that means a lot. I say a lot of what I do in the Church of Nazarene is just like bearing witness
mm,
to a way of living that is like really interested and focused on holiness in a Wesleyan way, but is also queer. And like there is like a way to live that is full of like joy and freedom and holiness in this way. So if I can do that and just like be around, I'm going to do that.
I love that. And I love that too, because I think especially for younger queer folks, but queer folks in general too. Like I think mental health is so important in like taking care of yourself. And that's something that you've been outspoken about on social media, I've seen. And like, what do you think? I mean, does your faith help in that regard? Or do you have other spiritual practices, self-care tools that help you be a happy Nazarene?
Yeah, well, and there's actually a chapter in the book where I pulled a lot of studies about
Mm,
LGBTQ people and their mental health and the
mm,
way that church participation works with that. And I mean the studies, the research is so clear that like queer people in non-affirming religious spaces are way worse off and
mm,
queer people in affirming religious spaces are great. And like
mm,
that is just it's so obvious and it's this huge difference and it's like well done. Again, for me personally, like it's not that big of a struggle and I don't really know why that is, there's a lot of reasons why it should be. I think maybe to some extent I just like don't really care. I don't know. And like I said, I've been really lucky. Like the actual people that I actually, am in community
right.
with are, great and love me. And so like that works. But yeah, as far as like practices and things, like I am recently in therapy, which is great.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Starting this, journey. And yeah, I don't know. I think just being really clear about even like boundaries, right? Of
Yeah.
like what is the church allowed to do to me? Like
Mm,
like as a whole, like the church. or individuals in a congregation, like I don't want it to have the power to like crush me. That's not what
Yeah.
it's about. It should be a place where I can grow and learn and, be cared for and care for others. Like that's what I'm there for. That's what it should be there for. And so that's what I do. That's what I do in church. That's why I go. And if that's not what's going on, if it's a harmful, toxic place, I'm not going to be showing up. And I know like a lot of people it's really fraught and it's a
Yeah.
really challenging situation, especially again with family. Like I can't even imagine. I'm so lucky that like I don't have that kind of like family church trauma situation. But yeah, I get really annoyed with the kind of flippant like gay people leave your church, like it's like come on people, it's not that easy. Especially for me, I get real riled up sometimes with that kind of rhetoric because I am a queer person in a non-affirming denomination and I like it and like obviously it's not perfect, but like no denomination is going to be perfect. So I'm going to just choose my battles and choose where I want to
Yeah.
be. And so like, I get so irritated with people being like, yeah, you should just leave. Like, okay, like, and do what, like what good would that do anyone?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, like, I'm always like, if you want to leave, like, yes, leave because it's not serving you and you're not
Hmm.
serving it, like, everyone's on their own journey. Everyone needs to figure out this balance and this sense of like, being real with yourself and thinking about what you want, what you need, what's serving you, what you're serving, and just like trying to figure that out. And again, like, yeah, it's not easy, but you have to do something. Like you have to make those decisions and like think about it
Yeah.
really carefully.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so important to people. Like just the ritual of going to church is so important. And it can be something that's so hard to disrupt and to really face what might really be going on in your church or how you might really be feeling about it. But really, if anything over the last 2 years has taught us anything with the pandemic, it's like it's good to sit down and really take stock of what's important to you and dedicate your time to things that matter and show up to spaces that are healthy for you and do that discernment for yourself,
Mhm.
perhaps in community with other people, talking to other people. But yeah, doing that work is really, it's so important. So important. Are there before we kind of wrap up, like, are there other books, resources as a librarian that you would recommend for people who are coming out in their church spaces, navigating this kind of territory? Anything that comes to mind?
Oh yeah, I mean, I have lists on lists on lists. Actually, one of the things I'm most proud of with this book is actually the bibliography. Like, I think
Mm.
it's really good. There's a lot of really good stuff in there.
Over here,
Um,
spoken like a true librarian. Like, oh, check out my
I
bibliography.
know. I know. Well, because there is so I talked a lot about queer queer theology and Wesleyan theology. Like no one's really working at that intersection. But there's so many people doing queer theology and affirming, theology for Christians out there. One of my favorites that really, inspired a lot of this book is Elizabeth Edmond's Queer Virtue. I love that book. It talks about how the lives of LGBTQ people already exhibit so many of these things that we consider Christian virtues. And I do pull a lot from that. And then likewise, Patrick Chang's From Sin to Amazing Grace. Love that one. That's a really good
Hmm.
uh, resource, I think.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this work, for occupying this space for folks in the Wesley denominations. Like, thank you um for doing that and for being on the show today. It's been really lovely.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
If you'd like to learn more about Keegan Osinski, you can find her online at keeganosinski.com and on Instagram at Keegs. That's spelled Keegz. A link to Keegan's book, Queering Wesley, Queering the Church, is in the show notes, along with a couple other book recommendations from her that you should definitely check out. I know I'm going to add them to my list. And make sure you stay in the loop with the show by hitting subscribe or follow wherever you're listening and leave us a rating or a review. Those really go a long way toward helping others find our show. You can also find us on Instagram at Out Loud Stories, and you can find me at It's Greg Thompson. You can also sign up for my email newsletter, where you'll get updates on all my work, including the latest on Out Loud. You'll find all those links I just mentioned in the show notes. I'm your host, Greg Thompson. Our theme music is by JP Ruggieri, and we record in Richmond, Virginia. Until next time, remember, friends, queer people have faith lives too. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Thanks for listening.